I'm John Cook. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. I research climate misinformation, understanding it, detecting it, and countering it.
Fantastic. So, what's your personal motivation? What initially motivated you to focus your career on climate change misinformation, and how has your perspective evolved about this over time?
My initial motivation wasn't about career, it was really the issue. And specifically, the motivation was beating my father-in-law in an argument about climate change. He was a climate denier, still is a climate denier, and I wasn't really that engaged with the issue, but we just got into a conversation at a family lunch about climate change, and he started throwing all these arguments that climate change wasn't real, it wasn't human caused, it was a hoax. And I went away and started researching it and realised this is not based on science, this is all misinformation. And as a son-in-law that likes to win arguments with his father-in-law, I just started really researching all the different arguments and what the science said about each one. And eventually I realised other people might find this useful information as well. So I started a website, Skeptical Science, which was debunking climate misinformation. And then that started a long life journey to where I am now, researching climate misinformation.
Wow, just winning arguments can be such a strong motivator to research. I wonder how many other academics started their career because they wanted to win an argument.
I'm going to guess that I'm a little unusual and a bit controversial. Like, I actually started academia doing a physics degree and then left academia and did graphic design and cartooning for over a decade. And then starting this climate website gradually pulled me back into academia, this time not doing natural science research, but doing social science.
I wonder if that's an angle, motivating people to win arguments through rationality in climate change debates.
Well, I mean, there's something to that, because what my research eventually led me towards was not so much winning arguments, but at least becoming immune to being misled. People don't like being misled. And so my work has found that if you teach people the tricks to mislead, then those tricks no longer work on them.
So what's the difference then between misinformation and disinformation? And do you distinguish these terms clearly?
Yeah, they're definitely two different things, or two different definitions. Misinformation is the umbrella term. It's all false information, regardless of the motive of the person who's promoting the misinformation. But disinformation is a subset of misinformation that's intentional deception. People know that it's false and they're intentionally trying to mislead you. So misinformation, people might genuinely believe what they're saying, whereas disinformation, they know that it's misleading.
Are there any other subcategories of misinformation that we're missing, or are they the major two?
Well, the other big one I think it's important to be aware of is malinformation, which is misinformation that's designed to harm people by discrediting them, by trying to discredit their work, ad hominem attacks, conspiracy theories, and that's a big part of the misinformation landscape.
So it sounds like malware, except just human information spreading in the form of, as a sort of malware.
I'd have to think through that analogy, because malware is really, it's software or it's a script that's trying to harm or disable a system, right? And so whether malinformation is the same, maybe. I'd have to think through the analogy.
So in your research, you have extensively studied the dynamics of climate change misinformation. Could you please elaborate on the most common strategies employed by climate change denialists and how these tactics may have evolved over time?
Yeah, so our research, we're trying to understand climate misinformation, and it's huge, there's just so much of it. And so we've turned to machine learning as a way to make sense of all this big data problem. And with machine learning, we basically trained a machine to detect the different categories of climate misinformation. And then we turn this model to different data sets. YouTube, Twitter, blogs, and conservative think tank websites. And what we find is the different places have different emphases. Conservative think tanks, they focus on policy misinformation, arguing that climate solutions won't work or are harmful. Blogs focus on attacking climate science, so saying that you can't trust climate models, you can't trust climate data like thermometer measurements. And social media like YouTube or Twitter, they focus on attacking people, attacking climate scientists, promoting conspiracy theories, saying that climate scientists are all colluding to deceive us, that climate change is a hoax. And so you see these different emphases depending on the platform. And the basic, I guess, dynamic is the shorter the form of the message, the more feral it is. We go from sophisticated policy arguments all the way down to just attacking people.
Malinformation.
Yeah, that's right.
So some of the think tanks, maybe the Cato Institute or the Heritage Foundation, do they all have their different sort of angles slightly, or do you think that they're all pretty much doing exactly the same thing?
Most of the conservative think tanks are similar. Like they are mainly about arguing that this climate policy will be harmful to the economy or raise prices or just harmful in some way, or it will be ineffective. That's the main gist of their arguments. But there are a few think tanks, or one in particular, that is a bit of an outlier amongst them, the Heartland Institute. They have, over the years, while most of the other think tanks are transitioning more and more towards solutions misinformation, policy misinformation, the Heartland have doubled down on science denial. And they continue to argue that the science is a hoax, or arguing that climate change isn't real. Stuff that everyone else has moved on from, but the Heartland is still deep in there.
Why do you think that is? What's the background behind the Heartland Institute that motivates it to keep whipping a dying horse?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was at a Heartland conference in Washington, D.C., actually at the Trump Hotel once. And so it would have been a good chance for me to try to understand that better, what drives them. Unfortunately, they kicked me out after a couple of hours once they learned I was there. So I didn't get as much of an insight. They were actually quite upset to see me there.
They don't like interlopers.
Well, they don't like me. It's funny because I joke about this with my colleagues, the machine learning colleagues that have done that research. I love them because they've published papers that delve into Heartland and talk about them a lot, whereas I tend to deconstruct their misinformation and show how they're false, and that's crossing the line for them, and that's where I've got onto their blacklist.
Right. Well, watch out. You don't want to be in there in any sort of wild think tanks crosshairs. They could, you could be dancing close to the fire there. So, what are some effective communication strategies, given your success with Skeptical Science and other educational initiatives? What communication strategies have you found to be the most effective in countering climate change misinformation among diverse audiences?
During my PhD, which was a psychology PhD focused on the question, how might we counter climate misinformation effectively, I happened upon a branch of psychological research called inoculation theory. This dates back to the 60s. The idea is that just like with vaccination, where you expose people to a weakened form of a virus, you can expose people to a weakened form of misinformation, and that builds up their psychological immunity so that they're less likely to be misled. And the way you do that, the way you deliver misinformation in a weakened form, is you explain the techniques used to mislead. So that's the communication technique that I've been focusing on. I call it technique-based inoculation or logic-based inoculation. Explain the misleading techniques. And most of my work is coming up with testing ways to do that effectively and trying to develop practical ways to implement that in the field in a scalable way.
So when I hear the word inoculation, I think biology, I think immunisation, I think needles. So it's a bit of a scary word. Have you experienced any pushback by people for the use of the term inoculation, saying, like for instance, skeptics are well known for trying to be meticulous in the use of definitions so as to not mislead people? Have people criticised you for using inoculation in a colloquial or a metaphorical way?
There have been some criticisms of inoculation theory as an analogy, but not so much because it's an analogy. I mean, all analogies are imperfect. Like, by definition, they simplify a more complicated thing, and eventually analogies break down if you keep trying to extend them. No, people haven't really taken that part of it too seriously. More, the criticisms have been bad faith criticisms from misinformation sources saying that inoculation is about trying to brainwash people, when it's not. It's actually the opposite. It's about building up people's critical thinking and building up their resilience against being misled. So another way that I frame the work we're doing is it's about building critical thinking, helping people think better, see through false arguments, identify logical fallacies, and who can be against stronger critical thinking.
I agree. So let's talk about psychological inoculation against misinformation more in detail. What are the best strategies and techniques?
Right. So there's two interventions or ways to counter misinformation: pre-bunking or debunking. Well, not the only two, but these are two main techniques. Debunking is explaining how misinformation is wrong after people have been exposed to misinformation, and pre-bunking is trying to get in there beforehand. And intuition says, well, pre-bunking should be better, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The research is really mixed on whether pre-bunking or debunking is better, and it really depends on lots of different contexts. For example, we ran a study where we tested pre-bunking and debunking and two different types of corrections: fact-based or logic-based. So showing how the misinformation is wrong through a factual explanation, or showing how the misinformation is wrong by explaining the fallacy. And we found that whether you're pre-bunking or debunking, the logic-based corrections worked. It reduced belief in the myth. But the fact-based only worked if the factual explanation came last. In other words, if you explain the facts to people and then they encounter the misinformation afterwards, the misinformation can cancel out the facts. And so this is a big, I think, important dynamic in terms of the interplay between misinformation and factual information. If we're in the business of explaining the facts to people, our efforts can be cancelled out by misinformation. Even if we get our facts out there and we reach lots of people and we do a good job explaining the facts, that can still be cancelled out by misinformation that casts doubt on our facts. So what this tells us is, whether you're pre-bunking or debunking, getting the facts out there is important, but it's insufficient. We also need to explain how those facts can be undermined by misinformation techniques.
Yeah, that rings true. I mean, the human brain can sort of store a lot of information, but we're not glorified lookup tables. We're not like, our brain isn't like a sophisticated library. It just, has pointers to all the facts you've ever encountered before. There's something to understanding, that is the algorithm or the logic behind how something works, that then allows people to sort of come at the facts with a grounding to how it all fits it together. It's so that makes a lot of sense to me. Your 2013 paper highlighting 97% consensus on human-caused global warming has been highly influential. In fact, Barack Obama and, was it Macron?
David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister.
Yeah, the UK Prime Minister Yeah, so how important do you believe consensus messaging is in the public understanding of climate change, and what challenges does it face?
So my PhD ended up being about consensus, particularly the psychology of consensus, how people think about it, and the effects of communicating the scientific consensus. And it was almost coincidence that during my PhD we did this paper quantifying the consensus right in the middle of the PhD, and it was also a coincidence that our paper came out at the same time that Obama was unrolling climate policy, and so he highlighted it, and then that just started this cascading effect of attention towards that paper. Initially positive attention, and then very quickly a lot of negative attention, like criticisms. And the reason why is because of the importance of consensus as a communication and psychological factor. So what my psychology research found over the course of my PhD was that perceived consensus is what we call a gateway belief, which means that when you understand that the experts agree that humans are causing global warming, that has a flow-on effect to a whole range of other beliefs. You're more likely to believe that climate change is real, that humans are causing it, that the impacts are bad, and you're more likely to support action on climate change. And so that means that communicating the consensus is crucially important, and it very effective. You just communicate a very simple message. 97% of climate scientists agree humans are causing global warming, and then that has this flow-on effect in improving people's general climate attitudes, including support for action.
Yeah, it makes sense, because if the authorities on a particular subject are largely in favour of one direction in an argument, then a lot of the other arguments that are for climate change will just naturally fall into place, in a sense.
Yeah, so when it comes to complicated scientific topics like climate change, people defer to the opinions of experts. And this kind of makes sense. Well, it doesn't kind of make sense, it makes sense. Because we don't have time, as busy people, to research everything. What's the situation on vaccines? I'm going to read all the scientific studies on vaccines. What's I'm just trying to think of random issues. Like every issue that comes, we don't have time to read all the scientific studies, including climate change. And so a mental shortcut or a heuristic that people use is, what do the experts think? That's just a basic fact of human psychology, and that's really what drives perceived consensus being a gateway belief.
It's true, like appeal to experts, and depending on the experts, it can be actually a really good thing, like you said, where we're not, unbounded rational agents where we can think of every sort of possibility. There's just too much information out there. So yeah, it really does make sense to rely on experts, especially when your expertise isn't even neighbouring the required expertise on a particular subject. So, okay, let's talk about collaborative efforts. Climate change is a global issue requiring collaborative efforts. How do you view the role of international collaboration in research and communication to effectively address climate misinformation?
So the big challenge with climate change is it's a global problem. It's been caused by, all countries, some more than others. But that means that global cooperation is essential. We can't solve climate change without global cooperation, and the consequence of that means that we all play a part. Australia, which emits something like less than 2% of the world's emissions, yet still can play a part in being a world leader in driving global cooperation, and that applies to all countries. Like one of the frustrating arguments from opponents of climate action is saying, well, this country, like Australia or any country really, is only a percentage of the world's emissions, so they shouldn't act. But if everyone argues that, then we'll never have that global cooperation and we'll never solve climate change. So we all need to be working together. And that's really hard. It requires, all the different political situations in all these countries, which are all incredibly different from each other, have to find a way to work together, as well as dealing with their domestic situations, domestic politics, and we need the public on board with climate action in order to get the political will, and then that brings in communication and education. We need to educate the public, we need to counter the misinformation, we need to raise public support, build social momentum for climate action, and then that leads to political action.
What about the role of cognitive psychology? As someone who has studied the cognitive psychology of climate science denial, what are some key psychological barriers that prevent people from accepting climate science, and how can these be addressed?
So there are underlying psychological barriers, such as psychological distance. The problem that climate change seems like this distant problem. It's spread out over the globe, so it doesn't seem immediate to us. It's happening over decades, so it's not happening right now, or it doesn't feel like it's happening right now. It is happening right now, it is happening right here, but it doesn't feel that way. And those factors that make it seem psychologically distant make people less concerned about it than immediate problems. And that's really hardwired into the human brain. We evolved to deal with immediate problems, like a predator jumping out of the bushes. And so that's our hardwiring is struggling to keep up with this global, decades-long existential crisis. That doesn't mean that we can't be concerned, because a lot of people are concerned about climate change, but it just makes it more difficult to communicate it. But I think the biggest barrier to solving climate change and to getting that public support is ideology, political ideology. People who oppose government regulation of industry, people who think that governments should be small and shouldn't be solving society's problems, people who think that governments are the problem, not the solution, they tend to oppose the solutions to climate change, which often involve government regulating the fossil fuel industry. And then, because they don't like the solution, rather than propose their own solutions, instead they deny that there's a problem in the first place, and that's where we see climate misinformation come. It really began with conservative think tanks. These are organisations that believe in small government, in unregulated markets. They saw that coming down the pipeline were climate solutions that involved regulation. So in the early 1990s, history was really at a crossroads when the conservative think tanks had a choice. They could propose conservative, market-friendly solutions to climate change, or they could misinform the public about the reality of climate change. And it is a huge historical tragedy that they opted for the misinformation. They became a prolific source of misinformation, and that really began the climate misinformation campaigns. It polarised the public. It fostered this ideological divide where we eventually got to the point, after several decades of misinformation, that to be conservative meant to be sceptical about the reality of climate change. I will caveat that in some countries more than others. Polarisation is greatest in the US and Australia, not so much in other countries, and it hasn't always been polarised. So being polarised about climate change is not hardwired into the human brain. It was engineered, it was manufactured historically by these conservative think tanks and fossil fuel companies.
Once part of the Cato Institute, a conservative-leaning think tank, Jerry Taylor changed his mind about climate change after he reviewed the information thoroughly and said something along the lines that we should be distributing our credence over a variety of possible futures. He said that climate change data is out, it looks real, we should be apportioning some credence to the climate change future, and I've changed my mind. I think that climate change is real. And so you've spoken to this guy, John.
Yeah, Jerry Taylor. So the conversion experience that he describes is actually really interesting, because what happened was he was a spokesperson for the Cato Institute. He would go out on TV or go do public interviews or debates, and he had a TV debate with, I think it was Joe Romm, about climate change. And he was presenting these arguments that were given to him by Pat Michaels, who is a climate denier at the Cato Institute. Pat Michaels is a former climate scientist, so an actual expert, who promotes climate and generates a lot of climate misinformation. After the debate, I guess they were probably in the green room afterwards, and Joe Romm said, "You do know that that argument that Pat Michaels gave you was wrong. It's misinformation." And Joe explained the argument, and Jerry realised that Pat Michaels was feeding him misinformation that he was then going out and saying in public. And the realisation that he was being given misinformation, he was being misled by Pat Michaels, was the turning point that then made him re-look at the evidence for climate change, and then he changed his mind. So that really comes back to that dynamic. When people realise they're being misled, that can open their minds to being more I guess, balanced or open and considering the evidence for climate change.
It seems like it's an uphill battle to get conservative-leaning climate change deniers to go through a paradigm shift, because it's really hard for people to sort of discard things that they've held true to their heart.
Yeah, I doubt that people have this kind of, road to Damascus blinding light moment where they, it probably happens over time. But I think you put your finger on one of the difficulties, which is we become affiliated with our tribe. Like humans are social animals, and we belong to social groups, and that forms part of our identity. And also we take on the beliefs of our tribe. And so if all of your beliefs of your tribe are climate change is a hoax, and those other people who believe climate change are different to us and we don't trust them, and then you hear evidence that says, no, actually climate change is real and all the beliefs of your tribe are false, you have the choice. Do you go against your tribe and risk the exclusion from it? And that's a very difficult thing for people to do. So it's not just about is this evidence credible, and let me assess the sources. There's also social dynamics, and they go much deeper and more fundamental than kind of even belief systems.
So let's talk about digital media, AI, and real-time fact-checking and other forms of automation. So we've just spoke about cognitive psychology. Let's talk about AI psychology, or artificial intelligence anyway. So the impact of digital media, the current age of huge amounts of digital media, misinformation can spread rapidly. How has the rise of social media and other digital platforms influenced the spread of climate change misinformation, and what strategies can be employed to combat this on digital media?
Yeah, social media definitely exacerbated the climate misinformation problem, because it meant that by removing gatekeepers, anyone could reach potentially millions of people promoting misinformation. It made it much easier for misinformation to spread, much faster and much deeper. And then the algorithms just made that even worse. Algorithms found, well, you have to understand that social media platforms' business models are based on interaction. Clicks, likes, shares, and misinformation is more likely to be clicked, liked and shared because it often evokes emotional responses, whereas the facts tend to be nuanced, complex and boring relative to misinformation. And so misinformation has been found in studies to spread much quicker and deeper than factual information. That's good for social media platform business. So the algorithm is friendly to misinformation often, and it spreads and influences a lot more people than pre-social media.
You're one of the people who developed an algorithm to detect climate change misinformation that Facebook used for a while. Do you want to talk about your experience there?
So, I don't even remember the year, but a number of years ago I got contacted by some political scientists in the UK who had developed a model for just doing topic analysis of climate misinformation. So this wasn't detecting misinformation, it was more just detecting the different topics that they were talking about. And I said, well, this is great. It kind of gives us an insight into misinformation, but could we train a machine learning model to detect specific misinformation claims? And so we started a collaboration over years of training a model to detect all the different categories of climate misinformation. And eventually what we landed on was 5 different categories of misinformation. It's not real, it's not us, it's not bad, the solutions won't work, and attacks on climate science. And we trained our model to detect these 5 different categories and all the different sub-arguments underneath them. And then we started pouring data into our model. Initially, conservative think tanks, contrarian blogs. Then we started looking at other data sets like Twitter, YouTube, where at the moment looking at newspaper opinion pieces and other, we can keep going, you know, it's basically almost a limitless amount of data that we could really run through this model. Our model, we call it C.A.R.D.S. The C.A.R.D.S model was never used by Facebook. I was working with Facebook on climate misinformation and I brought it to their attention, but I think they prefer their own in-house methods. And so working with Facebook for a little while, I got a bit of a kind of peek behind the curtain and an insight into the dynamics within the corporation. And what I've learned is that there are lots of different competing kind of influences within the corporation. It's not just one big monolith. The group I was working with were genuinely trying to do something about climate misinformation, but every 2 steps forward they made would be pushed 1 step back by other forces such as legal or the executive. And so there was this constant tug of war trying to, I guess, grapple with controversies like how Facebook has made the climate misinformation problem worse. And I think that they would bring in interventions and then they would take them away, and they're always iterating and changing things as they try to navigate the path of least controversy.
Let's talk about automated misinformation handling. During your tenure with the team working on misinformation handling tools, could you discuss the key challenges and breakthroughs in developing these tools, and how do they discern between genuine content and misinformation? And what role do you see for human oversight in this process, humans being in the loop?
Yeah, so well, you already touched on one of the big challenges. So it turns out detecting the misinformation was the easiest part. And we've really solved that problem. And as we got over that, and I thought that was kind of, at the beginning, I thought, okay, we solved that, we've solved the problem. Then the problems had only just started. Because once you are able to detect the claims from contrarian sources, then you have to work out, are they actually misinformation claims or not? Because some of it, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. And some of the claims they would make are either true or at least debatable. There's good faith debate on both sides about some of these issues. But even that, I don't think, is the most difficult challenge in terms of automated debunking of misinformation. I think the most difficult part is generating automated debunkings that are accurate and effective. And that is what we're currently working on. Now, firstly, you want to make sure that you're debunking, if it's generated using AI, you want to make sure that there's no misinformation in there. You don't want to be adding to the problem. You want to make sure that you're providing reliable, accurate information. Secondly, you want to make sure that your debunkings are effective. They're going to work. So that's a psychology communication issue. And there is a whole body of psychological research into how to effectively debunk misinformation. What we're currently trying to do is bring our AI work in line with the psychological research to create effective debunkings, as well as assess the accuracy of our models to make sure that we're generating reliable, accurate content as well.
So you have people come in and assess the output of these models. Mind you, these large language models are somewhat opaque. We haven't yet solved the interpretability problem. We don't know how they're actually generating the output exactly. So yeah, we can't just look at the source code and see, that's where it went wrong. It's very much like a behavioural science in a sense.
Yeah, well, what we are finding is, because what we're asking the AI to do is quite complex, we're asking them to not only identify that a claim is misinformation, then you have to identify what is the key fact that debunks this myth, and then you also have to identify what is the fallacy that the misinformation commits to undermine the facts. So there's these three different things, and what we have found is a generative AI model like ChatGPT, which is very sophisticated and powerful, is not very good at doing these tasks by itself off the shelf. We have to hand feed it, spoon feed it certain parts of the puzzle in order for it to generate accurate answers. In other words, we have to detect the fallacy ourselves separately. We also need to spoon feed it relevant factual information relevant to the myth, and put all that into a sophisticated prompt, and then see what the large language model outputs.
You've tried smaller, localized, open source large language model like Palm 2. I'm not sure if you've tried Llama 2, but yes, look, they didn't generate reliable output as much as ChatGPT 4, right?
Well, we're, with the qualifier that we're right in the middle of this, and we're in the middle of testing different models. We're doing Palm 2, we're doing ChatGPT 3.5 versus 4, and then comparing them all. So we really haven't landed on the final solution yet. So I'm talking about research as it's being done. We're right on the edge of our knowledge right now. But ultimately, our goal is to find an open source model, which will be less resource hungry and less expensive, which will be more practical at deploying at scale.
Were the Palm 2 models, were they quantized models, or did you have to train them fully yourself beforehand? Because quantized models aren't very specific.
We didn't do any further training of the model. And I'm a little bit hesitant here because this work was done by the computer scientist, not me. So I'm just paraphrasing how he's described it to me. But generally we didn't use, we do have training data, but we haven't used it with our LLMs. We basically are feeding in information in our prompt. So it's the prompt that's giving the models any information it needs and instructions in order to generate output. We started this early last year, and our initial thought was, let's just see whether ChatGPT off the shelf can debunk misinformation, all on its own. And the answer was no, it can't, because it was not good at identifying fallacies. And that to us was a deal breaker. If it's inaccurate identifying the fallacy of the misinformation, then the debunking contains misinformation itself. And that was a non-starter. And so we realized we have to identify the fallacy ourselves in some other way. And so we built a large training data set of examples of climate misinformation and what fallacy was in it. And we used that to train a model. And it performed quite well. In fact, it was quite a big jump ahead in terms of performance compared to earlier research on fallacy detection. And now, the way we use that model, our fallacy detection model, and that helps build the prompt in order to inform our generative AI model, saying, hey, this misinformation, it commits this fallacy, now explain this in a debunking. Well, and a lot of it is prompt engineering. So it could be just creative approaches. I don't think that our prompt approach is the only approach. So maybe it's, and we have gone through all these different little flowchart approaches, like bringing in the F.L.I.C.C model and bringing in our C.A.R.D.S model, and then we've tried using those in different interlocking ways. I think that it is very creative, and it can be, you can fit that Tetris model together in lots of different combinations.
What does C.A.R.D.S stand for, and what does it mean, the acronym?
C.A.R.D.S stands for Computer Assisted Recognition of Denial and Skepticism, which is a somewhat contrived acronym for our machine learning model research. We actually spent, way too much time trying to come up with a easy to remember acronym. And the other acronym I use a lot in my research is F.L.I.C.C, F.L.I.C.C. These stand for the 5 techniques of misinformation: fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. And so we now have a F.L.I.C.C model and a C.A.R.D.S model. C.A.R.D.S detects the claims, the climate misinformation claims, like it's not real, it's not us. F.L.I.C.C model detects the fallacies, oversimplification, false dichotomy, fake experts. And you really need both models. You need to identify what is the factual claim being contested and what is the fallacy being used. You need both of those in order to debunk the misinformation. So within the C.A.R.D.S model, we have these 5 categories of misinformation. And one of those categories is attacking climate science. And then underneath that, you have different ways to attack climate science. Attacking climate models is one of the big ones, but also attacking climate scientists. Ad hominem attacks against people is another big one. And it's interesting that these 2 different types of attacks are more or less prominent depending on the platform. On blogs, they attack climate models. It's more about attacking the science. But on Twitter, they attack the people. They attack climate scientists. And it's more about ad hominem attacks. So you do have different flavors of misinformation depending on the platform. And a really big qualifier about our research is we are still early in. Like we're still just trying to create a debunking that we would be comfortable with, showing to people. But how you actually deploy that, we're not even at that stage yet. And this research, this technology could be deployed in lots of different ways. It could be fully automated. You could have bots that go out there and respond to misinformation. But there are potential issues there. Not just, there's ethical issues, there's technical issues, and psychological issues, like social issues, how people feel about, is a bot actually going to be an effective communication tool? Then you have semi-automated approaches, such as you could generate debunkings, but then let people curate them and post them. So that could solve a lot of the ethical issues with a fully automated approach. And then you can use it just to let people know what's out there without actually having an intervention or response, like a kind of for example, a newsletter that just said, here is what the model has detected. But across all these different solutions, I think you need to clearly communicate that models are not infallible. One way that we've talked about how you might handle that is kind of treat it in the same way as a weather forecast. You say, our model detected this misinformation claim, but with 80% certainty. So we're not saying we know this is definitely it, but our model is 80% confident that this misinformation is there, as a way of communicating that this kind of automated approach isn't like 100% foolproof, but really it's about confidence levels.
Like, I mean, we've seen a lot of news about deep fakes and fake stories coming out. So let's talk about AI in creating misinformation and disinformation now and in the future. Looking at the immediate near-term future, what advancements in AI do you anticipate will be the most significant in both generating and combating misinformation and disinformation? And how might these developments change the landscape of misinformation it's handling in the next few years in the medium term?
I think a big dynamic in AI, both generating and countering misinformation, will probably be personalization or customizing the misinformation to appeal to specific audience segments. And we've seen that already in a less AI way, but like even going back to like the 2016 US election, there was a lot of Facebook ads that specifically targeted demographics manually, but it was really effective because they were messages that were tailored for specific audience members.
Big Cambridge Analytica scandal about that.
Right. And although I'm a little bit I think Cambridge Analytica kind of oversold their role. Like they played a part, but I think even just grunt force Facebook ads were as or more effective. But yeah, certainly there was a lot of ethical issues with Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, and how they handled people's personal data. But like recent studies have shown that misinformation that is tailored using generative AI to appeal to a person's particular belief or demographics or social situation or whatever, something unique to them, is more effective than generic misinformation, which isn't super surprising, but it is concerning because it means that generative AI has added another toolbox to misinformation, and now they can amp up the impact of their misinformation by targeting audiences. And one thing we've talked about, but we haven't even got close to looking at, is could you use generative AI to tailor debunking so that it's more effective with audiences. So it's not about manipulating people, but it's about removing roadblocks. Some people will see a debunking and already resist it or put up barriers because of the way it's framed or communicated. So can you frame debunkings in a way that's more, more relevant to people, more resonating? This is all very speculative at this point. We're not even getting close to implementing research, exploring that.
Yeah, well, it certainly makes sense. It's like, even if the guy is fighting to try and get the truth out there and like trying to ground all the information about climate change to real science, the most accurate models, even if they're the ones vanguarding the most sophisticated techniques with AI, it's still a technique that can be reverse engineered by the purveyors of disinformation and then used against the project of trying to combat misinformation.
Yeah, and usually the misinformers are ahead of the curve. They're the things like I often get asked, all these psychology communication techniques that you talk about, could they be used by misinformation purveyors? And yes, they do, and they have, and they were probably doing it before we'd even figured them out. And a good example is consensus messaging. Now, it was like 2011 was when psychology researchers, like my old boss, Ed Maybach at George Mason University, he published some of the earliest research finding that perceived consensus is a gateway belief and we should communicate consensus. It's an effective message. But rewind 10 years earlier, Frank Luntz, who was a Republican political strategist, had done focus group research and found that if you cast doubt on consensus, then you effectively win the debate on climate change. Because once people doubt that the experts agree, then they're less likely to support action on climate change, and the policy debate becomes irrelevant. And so he basically advised Republicans, cast doubt on the consensus on climate change, and you win the public debate on climate change. 10 years before social scientists were publishing research about the gateway belief and perceived consensus. So they were way ahead of the curve.
I remember a phrase, teach the controversy. Was this a pedigree of Frank Luntz's work?
I think teach the controversy probably predated Frank Luntz. He was doing policy work on climate change, like in the context of American elections, whereas teach the controversy goes back probably decades in the evolution debate, and creationists trying to get creationism into classrooms. That goes back well into the 20th century. So and that's another flavour of the same dynamic. Teach the controversy is about trying to promote the idea that there is this ongoing debate, scientific debate about an issue, which is really about casting doubt on the expert consensus.
Let's talk about the long-term AI strategies. In the longer term, what do you envision as a possible ultimate potential of AI in addressing misinformation, disinformation and malinformation? And are there any specific milestones or breakthroughs that you foresee that could fundamentally alter our approach to combating malinformation?
This is now you're getting asking questions where it's kind of the edges of when they ask, what's your 5-year plan or whatever, like this is kind of towards the end of the 5-year plan. But I think that when we have got the technology to the point where we're happy with the quality of our automatic debunking, then the question is, how do you deploy it in effective, scalable and ethical ways? And I think that and I don't know the exact form, and I think I will need to be working with an even broader set of experts in other disciplines than I already am. But I think it will involve hybrid human technology interaction. Ideally, I would like to see technology being used to build human resilience, build human critical thinking. So if you could overlay technology over misinformation in a way that people can see it but also learn how to spot it themselves, that would be the ideal solution for me. Whether that's practical, whether that is effective, is yet to be determined, but it's an empirical question that we can test scientifically.
Let's talk about political impartiality and fairness in fact-checking. So has fact-checkers in social media been fair and impartial? Do people lose trust in fact-checking when it reports misinformation, which in many cases, most of which is coming from one side of the political spectrum, thinking that it's politically tainted or liberally biased?
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge, right? Like, in fact, in about half an hour, I'm heading over to RMIT, and the fact checkers there tell me that during the Voice campaign, the bulk of the misinformation was coming from the No campaign, and so they fact checked those claims, and then they were accused of bias because most of their fact checks were focused on one side, but it was a reflection of the fact that the misinformation was coming from one side, but it's this irony, right? Because one side is generating the misinformation, then they use the disproportionate fact checking to cast doubt on the fact checking, and really try to cover themselves from accountability. And so this is a challenge for fact checkers as well. How do they grapple with that? Misinformation often targets people, like, for example, climate scientists are often attacked, and the point of that is to discredit them, undermine public trust in climate science. We see the same dynamic with fact checkers. Misinformation sources who are being held accountable by fact checkers also attack the fact checkers to try to undermine public trust in them. And so public trust is a big factor in this whole misinformation and fact checking situation.
Okay, so let's talk about why climate experts are disengaged with climate misinformation, why some of the experts have stepped back from being vocal about misinformation. Is it the case in other areas of expertise, or is it just climate misinformation that they don't want to engage in anymore?
Ivory towers are comfortable, and climate scientists, all scientists, academics, they live in their ivory towers, and they really just want to do their quiet research and do their science. To engage with misinformation means going down on the street and really getting into pretty nasty street fights with people who really can get pretty feral. And that is not pleasant, and a lot of people just aren't built for that, and that's fine. Like, they shouldn't have to necessarily have to get into these street fights. Now, we do need climate scientists to engage the public. They are the most trusted source of information about climate change. And so it is important that climate scientists do get training to be better communicators and are encouraged, are given incentives to get out there and talk to the public. And I would like climate scientists to be more engaging with misinformation and pushing back against it. But I also understand, as someone who's got attacked a lot for my own work, I understand it's pretty tough, and not all people are built for that kind of thing. The way I was able to cope with it, particularly back in 2014, 2015, when it was at its worst, was the fact that I was a misinformation researcher, not a climate scientist. And so the misinformation and the attacks that were being directed at me were the same things that I was studying. So it was kind of like being thrown into the petri dish and seeing it close up. So I tried to look at it from a more abstract, kind of meta scientific kind of way. Not everyone can do that, because not all people are misinformation researchers. So yeah, that was a bit of a word salad. I'm not sure if I quite answered your question.
No, that was good. There's another side to the question about targeted attacks on people criticising the misinformation out there. Has that been a phenomenon at all?
Oh, definitely. So what we've seen is an evolution in climate misinformation from initially attacking scientists and the science, and then as researchers like myself started pushing back against the misinformation, now there are attacks on misinformation researchers. So we're even seeing this at the highest levels in the government. Like Jim Jordan is a congressman in the US, and he has been targeting and subpoenaing researchers in the US who are studying misinformation, and really trying to intimidate them and stop them from researching misinformation.
Historically, there was a shift in misinformation strategy from attacking science to attacking solutions. What are some examples of this, and why do you think they shifted? And where do you see the strategies evolving into the future?
So misinformation as a research field exploded in 2016, really following the US election and also the Brexit referendum, because misinformation played big parts in influencing those outcomes. And since then, both, I think misinformation itself has exploded, because I think a lot of bad faith actors realise, hey, wow, we can really do something here. And also misinformation researchers have really focused and just exploded in their efforts to try to understand and counter misinformation. And you know, like in communication, the kind of our version of Newton's second law, third law, is with every impact comes equal and opposite pushback. So as misinformation research has become stronger and better at countering misinformation, then there has been a pushback against those efforts to try to neutralise them. So misinformation happened, we have developed ways to neutralise it. They're trying to develop ways to neutralise our neutralising. It's kind of like an arms race. And so the strategies they use take lots of different forms. There's just simple intimidation of misinformation researchers. There are attempts by policymakers, politicians to either intimidate them or stop them from doing their research or calling out misinformation. And there are more subversive, and this is where it really gets problematic. There are more subversive, like postmodern takes on the issue of misinformation. What is misinformation? What is truth? How do we know if anything could be fact or false? Who are you to be the arbiters of truth? And it's this kind of nihilistic, well, we can't really know, we can't really fact check. Or there's less corrosive versions of that, which are things like, well, who are you to fact check, or fact checkers are biased, they can't, they're not valid sources of fact checking, or fact checking is actually making things worse because they're breeding distrust. And so there's all these pushbacks against the efforts to counter misinformation. And it's not only from misinformation sources, sometimes it's coming from within academia as well. Like, academia is not a monolith, it's quite the opposite. In fact, there's lots of different factions, and it's part of the power of the scientific method is we have these debates, we wrestle it out, and then gradually over time evidence wins out, and our scientific understanding becomes more robust. And we're going through that with misinformation as well.
It seems to me like in some corners there's a battle against grounded truth, or whether truth can actually be grounded, where there's any fact of the matter about the universe which can be justified with science. And then if they're successful, we could be in a world where any opinion is just as valid as the next. Is one of the strategies that we could focus on trying to convince people of the validity of grounding truth in reality? Like, you know, sort of climate change realism?
Yeah, I think trying to cast doubt on whether we can know, you know, truth, whether facts are real, is one element of it. And again, it's coming from both misinformation and from some parts of academia. So it's quite subversive, and I think it undermines objective reality, really. But there's also like there's gradients there. Like there's degrees of objectivity, even in an issue like climate change. You have parts of climate change which are objectively factual, such as the reality of global warming, the reality of human-caused global warming. This is rooted in empirical evidence. We know this with strong scientific understanding. But then you have policy arguments, and that's where fact-checking gets more complicated, because saying this policy is the best policy or not, that sometimes it can be difficult or impossible to fact check those kind of statements. And so, while yes, there are objective facts, some claims are easier to fact check than others. That's why most of the research on climate misinformation tends to be in the shallow end of the pool. It's the really obvious science denial arguments, and that's the challenge there is that climate misinformation is actually transitioning towards policy misinformation and solutions, casting doubt on solutions. We need to be countering that misinformation, but it's also a more complicated and nuanced subject matter than just basic science denial. So that's the challenge that researchers like me are facing.
What about greenwashing? Like, there's a bunch of companies out there who sort of put a face of environmental friendliness up, but they're really not doing much behind the scenes in terms of how much money they're spending to mitigate their effect or their negative externalities effect on the environment, for instance. But they just want people to believe that they're doing the right thing, while behind the scenes they're just trying to make more money.
Yeah, greenwashing is a perfect example of complex misinformation. If a company says, we spent $100 million on solar panels, that could be a factual statement. But what it is doing is painting the impression that they're being an environmentally responsible company, when that 100 million is like 1% of their budget and 99% is spent on fossil fuels. So how do you fact check that kind of situation where they're making an actual factual statement, but it's painting a misleading impression? We've done some work on actually detecting greenwashing using similar machine learning techniques as we've done with the C.A.R.D.S model. But detecting it is just the first part. Really, in order to properly fact check it or whatever it is that you're going to do with it, you need to compare their statements to their behaviour. And if their statements are out of kilter with their behaviour, then you might look at exposing it as greenwashing messaging. If they're, for example, arguing that they're behaving environmentally friendly, but the bulk of their budget or activities or whatever are actually spent on environmentally damaging behaviour.
Okay, so let's talk about lensing and massaging messaging. So there's moderately palatable language versus the concern about the actual extinction risk. I'll give a bit of a preamble, and that is the idea that climate change and some sort of downstream effects may actually cause extinction or something close to it, extinction risk. How far is the messaging from the mainstream reports like IPCC from emphasising X risk or what some people perceive to be as alarmism? There's some real big think tanks in there who believe that climate change could be a major factor in causing extinction.
Human extinction.
Human extinction. Extinction of other life forms as well, which could be absolutely disastrous, right? Think of all the life that would be unrealised in the future if humans went extinct. So lives worth living. So what are your concerns here about the lensing of talking about such alarmist sounding issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. Firstly, just the basic science facts. We are currently already in the sixth mass extinction. So not talking about humans, but other species, the mass extinction is already happening. We've had 5 in the past when climate changed too quickly for species to adapt. Now climate is changing too quickly for species to adapt. So we are already experiencing that 6th mass extinction. I'm kind of delaying answering your question because it's a really hard question. So yeah, being a scientist, not an activist, I tend, my comfort lane is the more moderate language and not the more extremist. That said, I still believe that climate change is an existential threat. Even if it doesn't cause extinction, it's going to cause huge devastating damage to humanity, society, because all the different impacts, whether it's sea level rise threatening the bulk of humanity living on coastlines, the increasing extreme weather having all these impacts on people and infrastructure, all of that, even if humans aren't extinct, that's a way higher bar. I think that there is enough just from the basic science to be incredibly concerned and feel that climate action is imperative, that we have to do it with the utmost urgency. So I guess my answer to that question is I don't think you even need to go as far as talking about human extinction in order to express the urgency of it. But then I guess the other question is, do you need to? Do you need to communicate human extinction as a danger in order to get people to care? And I don't think you do. So I guess that probably answers that question. That's not to diminish people who, people can legitimately be concerned about that. I'm not trying to diss their fears. It's a non-zero chance. I think it's pretty low, the chance that humans get extinct. We're going to have a few billionaires in a bunker in New Zealand surviving, but again, that's a pretty low bar. Will humanity survive? I think, will humanity flourish is the more relevant question.
It can be quite anxiety provoking, and maybe people, if through desperation or panic, act irrationally, because desperate people do desperate things. So yeah, what about like a message of hope, efficacy, curiosity and compassion?
You definitely need hope and efficacy as part of the climate message. If it's just doom and gloom, that paralyzes people. But if you give them a path forward, that can activate them. So usually I think you need a combination. You need some of the negative, impacts of climate change coupled with hope and efficacy. If it's just doom and gloom, it paralyzes. If it's just hope and kind of positive, warm fuzzies, then you don't get the urgency that the situation requires. So you need, this is a really bad problem, but we can solve it if we act. Let's get moving.
Absolutely. There was something you said about understanding policy rhetoric. So what rhetorical techniques in policy debates have you found, and how do we detect and understand them?
That's what we're working on now. Detecting and understanding and deconstructing and debunking policy misinformation. Some of the main techniques are impossible expectations. So demanding an impossible outcome from a single policy. Like, for example, our government might say, hey, if we do this policy, we can reduce our country's emissions by 20%, and that'll, be a big step forward. And I say, well, that's only going to change global temperatures by 0.01 degrees, so we might as well not bother. If we don't take that first step, we'll never take all the subsequent steps towards completely decarbonising society. So that's impossible expectations. Other arguments are oversimplification or misrepresenting policies in order to make them seem harmful and not helpful. So for example, they'll say, well, this policy will raise prices and households will have to pay $200 more per week on their energy and food bills or something, ignoring when the policies will build into their policy things like helping lower income families to cope with, for example, putting a price on carbon. So these are the kind of techniques you see, misrepresentation or impossible expectations, and being able to spot those general techniques can help people see the arguments which getting trotted out every time a new policy gets suggested.
How can people get involved? What's the future directions look like for people wanting to get involved in climate activism?
The first thing I would suggest to people is the most basic thing you can do is just open your mouth and start talking about climate change to people. Just even sending that social signal, because humans are social animals, matters. That send the social signal that you care about climate change, that you're concerned, that you think it's an issue that we need to do something about. That matters. You don't have to be a climate expert. You don't have to know all the arguments or all the fallacies and all that. You just have to communicate that you care, and that is a starting point. When we don't talk about it, that fosters climate silence, and then that sends a signal that people don't care about it, and then that has a reinforcing, spiraling effect. So we don't want to do that. So at the very least, start talking about it and communicating to people that you care about the issue. Then what I suggest is just connect with others. Find other people who are concerned about climate change. Find a local group, find an online group, and see what they're doing, and through that you can find actions that you can do to make a difference. And lastly, I would suggest bring what you've got to the climate issue. Everyone is unique, and everyone's uniquely into lots of different things. What I've tried to do to make a difference about climate change is bring all my different backgrounds and skills to it, whether it was my initial studies in physics and natural science, then cartooning and humour, then psychology, and then critical thinking and machine learning, and trying to bring all that together and combine it in unique, creative and hopefully impactful ways. Everyone else has different passions and skills and interests. Pull those together and use those in a unique way to amplify your voice.
Excellent. Thanks so much for carving some time out in your busy schedule, John. I really appreciate the time and the dedication you have to this cause. It's an amazing cause, and I know that myself, including a lot of other people, are really supporting you in what you do. So thanks so much for
My
spending
pleasure.
the time.
Really enjoyed talking to you.